So we're going to have some good discussion this morning. Last week, we kind of spent it setting some foundational things up. If you're new with us, or if you're just passing through the area and you happen to join us this morning, or if you just maybe caught our service online for the first time, let me bring you up to speed a little bit. We've been working through Matthew's gospel for quite some time now on Sunday mornings, and just seeing Matthew's impressions about Jesus. And one of the things that comes out is that Matthew believes that Jesus is this ultimate king, this representative of God who's come here to set up some form, at least, of God's kingdom here on earth. A way of living that operates completely contrary to many ways that the world tends to operate, just in and of, humanity's natural ways of thinking and natural ways of acting. It's very much in opposition, very much upside down compared to that. And so we've been walking through Jesus' life and his ministry and the way that he interacts with people, and we see a stark difference between the way that we usually interact with people. And we learn a lot from him and his example, and the teachings are challenging. And now we're walking through some of the last moments Jesus is spending with his followers and the last conversations he's having with different religious leaders in the area as well, because in the whole timeline of things, Jesus is about to be betrayed and arrested and crucified and resurrected and ascending in heaven. That's how the story progresses just around the corner. And so Jesus is having some of those final conversations. And last week we talked about a conversation that was happening concerning some different cycles. And he was really cautioning some of the religious and political leaders in Jerusalem and some of the people who were living in Jerusalem at that point in time who were really all about their own way of living. He was cautioning them against these cycles. And he was remarking how people usually a lot of people end up imitating this snake, this character that's introduced at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis chapter 3, who's kind of deceptive and kind of shrewd and kind of opposed to God's instructions. And so they end up making choices that lead down a path that ultimately ends in grief. And then they end up filling up this bucket, this measure, with injustices, oftentimes on a local level. In their local communities, they treat people in unjust ways, or sometimes like on a larger level, on a regional level or a national level, or at times in history, maybe even on a worldwide scale. These groups of people are all about perpetuating different forms of injustice. And so at some point in time in this cycle, God sends some of his messengers, some of his representatives, to offer them a different way, to invite people who are committing injustices into a better way of life, a way that leads to hope, and a way that restores communities and treats people with love and kindness. And oftentimes in that cycle, the people don't choose to listen. And they ignore God, they do whatever seems good in their own eyes, and this bucket of injustices that they've been filling reaches a tipping point, kind of spills back out on them. We talked about that cycle last week and some of the ways that cycle was about to impact Jerusalem. And Jesus was cautioning Jerusalem, this bucket's going to reach a tipping point. The things you've been doing against other people, these injustices, they're going to come back on your own heads at some point in time. And that time, maybe is a little closer than you think. And so Jesus has been sharing about those different cycles, just to bring you up to speed. And we're going to talk about some questions Jesus' followers asked today. But first, I want to start it out this way. I want to ask you a question. This is a pretty casual question, but it'll help us kind of get the mindset that we need to walk into things today. How many of you have a favorite season of the year? Got a favorite season? If you have a favorite season, start thinking of that in your head. And I want to ask some of you, first of all, what's your favorite season? And what's one way you can tell when that season is approaching? Okay? So who would like to answer that question for me? What's your favorite season, and how can you tell when it's close, it's near? Yes?
My favorite season is fall, and usually right after the peak of the heat, it starts getting down to a nice 70, 75.
Okay. So favorite season is fall, and you can tell because the heat, especially here, starts cooling off, and the highs are in the 70s instead of in the upper 90s or in the hundreds, right? Here in Southwest Utah. So it's a great clue. Somebody else, favorite season and the way you can show. I'm going to go back there at the back.
Spring.
Okay. Spring and what? Allergies. Great. Spring's here. It's my favorite. I've got allergies. Maybe there's like some good things as well, but it's definitely a key in that the season has arrived. Yeah. Favorite summer. All right. We'll get some variety here. What tells you summer is almost near? You love the heat and the 115-degree weather and everything that comes with it. Amazing. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. Winter. We've completed the. What about what tells you winter's on the way?
We spent maybe 2 winters here, but back
Okay? There's rain, cool weather, all of that's coming in. Yeah. I'll do one more right here. Wintertime, what shows you when it's close? You can see your breath in the air, yeah. Have those crisp mornings. Some of us crave it and some of us dread it, like the summer lovers out there, I guess. So my wife's favorite season is fall, is autumn, and some ways that I can tell that season is approaching. Apples go on sale in the groceries. Costco starts having their famous pumpkin pies that can feed an army. My wife starts to get excited. Our anniversary is in the fall. That's why our anniversary is in the fall, because it's her favorite season. My kids start talking about what they're going to dress up like for Halloween. The mornings start to feel crisp. I can see the leaves change. Not here, but like up in the mountains. I can see the leaves change. And so I know fall is on the way. And all these things are markers. We start to build fires in our fire pit in the backyard. And it sounds good to drink a warm beverage again. And all those things. And those are the cycles, those seasons come through. And some of us look forward to one season over another. But life is made up of seasons, and we all go through these cycles. But then the reality is, one day, our cycle through the seasons is going to be completed. That's kind of dark, but it kind of tracks with where Jesus is going. There is a sense in which our experiences, the human experiences that we see, and even the injustices that we observe in our world, they're cycles, and they've been part of every human's life who's ever lived, and they'll be a part of ours. But there's, in this case, actually a hope that cycle, because these are negative cycles, that someday all that negative cycling is going to come to an end. There's going to be completion. There's going to be something hope-filled to look forward to that. And that's what Jesus' conversation is leading us in today. And as Jesus is talking about those cycles, as he talked about that, we discussed it last week, and some of the consequences that Jerusalem will face. He made 3 different kind of alarming statements. And we briefly talked about them last week, but we're going to focus in on them today and some of the answers to these questions. Here's what Jesus said about those cycles and about his followers. He said, first of all, I'm going to send you, the people in Jerusalem who are kind of perpetuating these cycles of injustice, mistreatment of people, pretending to be religious but ignoring God's instructions. I'm going to send you prophets and wise people and scribes. And some of those people you're going to kill and crucify. And some of them you're going to whip in your synagogues. And some of them you're going to chase out of your town and chase from town to town. That's what's going to happen. I'm going to do that. And also, you leaders and residents of Jerusalem who are pushing against God's instructions, you're not going to see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, till you have a change of heart and you're willing to receive me as God's representative. And then he makes a final statement. Do you see all these things, these buildings and the temple complex in Jerusalem? He says, I tell you, not one stone will be left here on top of another. They're all going to be thrown down. They're all going to be destroyed. And these are some weird questions or weird statements. And Jesus' followers, they're in on the conversation. He's speaking with the people who are kind of perpetuating these cycles of injustice. But his followers are within earshot. And so they hear everything he's saying. And a little while later, they get him alone and they have some questions. And try to put yourself in the shoes of Jesus' followers, maybe his closest 12 and the surrounding people that were supporting his ministry and following him from place to place. If you were listening in on those things and you heard Jesus tell these leaders in Jerusalem, I'm going to send you some people and you're going to crucify them and kill them and flog them and chase them out from town to town. And you heard Jesus tell these people, you won't see me again in this temple until you have a change of heart. And you hear Jesus tell these people, one day these rocks and stones that form the temple complex, they're going to be ripped apart and this temple is going to be destroyed. What kind of questions would be swirling around in your head for Jesus? If you had him alone and you could ask a question or two, what would you ask him? Like, those are strange statements. What would be swirling around in your head? What do you think? What would you want to ask?
Why would these things happen?
Why would these things happen? Yeah, why? Like, why? This temple has been central to the worship of the God of Israel for years, centuries. Why would something like this happen? Why would God allow this to happen? Yeah, sure.
And how? Because the stones weigh nearly 400 tons apiece.
Yeah, these stones weigh tons. How is this is impossible, Jesus? How is this going to happen? Are you being like hypothetical here? Is this symbolic? How is this going to happen? Any other questions that might come to mind? Yeah?
Why don't we learn?
What?
Why don't we learn?
Why don't we learn? Yeah, why don't we learn from these same cycles? Yeah, why don't we ever learn? Sure. Yeah.
I always wonder to this day why some things I can't seem to get it right. In other words, I'm still learning lessons over things that I even had as a child.
Yeah, I think you're right. We are all learning lessons. Yeah, and Jesus followers are going to undoubtedly learn lessons that we will too as we walk through life. One of the things that I would be curious about, because Jesus is telling these religious leaders, I'm going to send you some people, and you're going to kill them, and you're going to beat them, and you're going to chase them out of your towns. As one of Jesus' followers, I would be thinking, who is he going to send? Am I one of those people he's going to send? Because Jesus called his apostles up. Well, the word apostle means sent one. And so I would be thinking, like, is that me? Am I the person he's going to send? Another question I might be thinking, and this is, I think, is one of the questions we know definitively they were thinking is, when is this going to happen? Right? When are these people going to rise up and kill your representatives? And when is this building going to be ripped apart? When's it going to happen? And so that's one of the questions they ask. In fact, verse 3, we're in the 24th chapter of Matthew 24. We're going to pick up in verse 3 and go to about verse 14 over the next maybe 15 minutes or so of this morning. It says, while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, so across from Jerusalem on the hillside, the disciples approached him privately and said, tell us, when are these things going to happen? Things that you were just talking about. When is that all going to go down? And so Jesus is going to answer these questions. This is intriguing, isn't it? I wonder. Don't you wonder? When are these things going to happen? But I want us to keep two things in mind. First thing is this. When people ask Jesus questions, Jesus doesn't always answer the question. Sometimes Jesus says whatever the person needs to hear at the moment. And this makes it really tricky in understanding parts of what Jesus says in the New Testament, because it's not always a direct answer to the question. Sometimes he just tells people what they need to hear. He sidesteps the question and says what they really need to hear in the moment. And so some of what Jesus says might not be an answer to their question directly. It might be what they need to hear. So keep that in mind, first of all. The second thing to keep in mind is Jesus' students, they ask him questions about 3 different events. When his representatives are going to be killed and chased out from town to town. When this building's going to be ripped apart. And when he's going to come back to the temple and the leaders will actually have a change of heart. So those are 3 different events. And so it's possible that his answer to the question when is going to address one of those questions. And it's possible that his answer to the question is going to address 2 of those events at the same time. And it's possible that it's going to deal with all 3 simultaneously, or any combination, or that his answer is going to weave in and out. And so we need to understand that it's not necessarily going to be a clear answer, because the when involves 3 different things. And so maybe, like in our culture, we would say, well, question number 1, that answer about when these people are going to chase my representatives out, it's going to be this date. And when this building is going to be ripped apart, it's going to be this date. And when I'm going to come back is going to be this date. And that's how we do it in our culture. But Jesus doesn't operate that way. And we see that as his answer. It's going to be a lot like this. I want to give you a scenario to kind of help you step into the way Jesus is going to answer. Let's suppose one of you came up to me and said, so Jason, how long are you going to serve as the pastor here at Mountain View Bible Church? And this was my answer. I said, well, there's going to be some peach days that happen. And there's going to be some Winterfests and Laverkin 4th of July celebrations. And some people are going to be elected. And some kids are going to go to school from year to year. And some politicians will probably make some promises along the way that they know they can't keep. And that's the way it's going to start. Some of you guys are going to get mistreated while I'm here at some point, or hurt or betrayed by some of your friends. And we're probably going to have some water shortages in southwest Utah. And people might even make some claims about God with the intention of manipulating people. And the police are going to make some arrests in town. And that's how I answered your question. And then I just said, and someday I won't be the pastor here anymore. And you're like, well, gee, thanks, Jason. That was a clear answer. Like, when's it going to happen? Or is there a point in time? Do you have some objective out in the future? Are you just going to die off and then you won't be the pastor anymore? And I'm like, and I just leave you, and that's my answer. And that's what it's going to feel like when Jesus gives his answer to his followers today. I just want you to know that up front, okay? It's going to feel very like open-ended on this. And we're not done with the conversation. We're not going to be done with the discussion today, but it's going to feel that way, and it may continue to feel that way even after we've wrapped up this conversation on chapter 24. And so Jesus is going to talk about his answer about the when in terms of seasons, in terms of cycles, kind of how we mentioned those seasons up front. Fall, winter, spring, summer, and the cycle goes on and on and on. And that's how he's going to answer the when. Maybe because that's what his followers need to hear about for some reason. And maybe because that's part of the answer to the time frame and the when. But he's going to tell a couple things. First thing is that the same human cycles, they're going to continue. This injustice is not going to stop, at least not anytime soon. Here's Jesus' answer to the when. When are these things going to happen? He says, first, watch out so nobody misleads you. And that's not an answer to when, is it? But maybe it's what they need to hear. Be careful as you live life, my followers, he's saying to his students, because people might try to mislead you. So just be careful about that. And then he gets into these cycles. And he gives you more cycles that are common to humanity, cycles that we see in our world still today. He says, many people will come in my name saying, I am the Messiah, and they will mislead many. And from my point of view, I used to hear this statement and think, well, there's a lot of people that are going to come in the future claiming to be Jesus. I think it might be a little broader than that. Because the idea of the Jewish Messiah is this person who is a spokesperson for God here on earth, who also has this right to rule. And if you think back through history about all the people throughout world history and empires who have claimed to be a king or a leader or ruler who speaks for God, how many papers could you fill up with a list of different individuals? Think about the emperors and the pharaohs and the queens and the kings throughout history who have said, I am God's representative on earth. I speak on behalf of God, so do what I say. I am the voice of God here on earth. Think about that. Isn't that a cycle that we see over and over and over again throughout human history? Many people will make these claims. Next, he says, you're going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed because these things are necessary. That's kind of an interesting statement. They're necessary? We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, let's talk about the cycle. Another cycle that we see as humans all the time are wars. And it's broader than just like national conflict. It's fighting between people, it's battles, it's conflicts, disagreements. That's going to occur. How many of you see those things happening in your world, between nations, between friends, between family members? War and conflict seems to be a human cycle that we're caught up in. And Jesus says these things are necessary. They're necessary. Why would war and conflict and violence be necessary? What would they cause to result? And if we look at anything through the lens of our discussion last week, or even through the Bible as a whole, perhaps the thing that they lead to and they cause are these tipping points that we talked about last week, where people commit violence and then the bucket fills up and the bucket spills out over on them again and again and again, and that results. But maybe Jesus is alluding to the fact that there may be a coming tipping point that's the last tipping point of all tipping points, where things finally change. Because look what he says next. He says, but the end is not yet. And that word end, it means the completion. The completion. And that's kind of a glimpse of hope, because we see all these wars and battles and fights and conflicts, and sometimes we're involved ourselves. And we think, when is this going to end? When are people going to change? When is the conflict in my life going to stop? And Jesus says the completion isn't yet, but that implies that there's some day when things are going to wrap up, and that we should expect these human cycles to be completed at some point in time. And I want to ask this question to you. In terms of completion, where is the story of the Bible ultimately headed? What is the last page of the story, so to speak? Where is the story of the Bible ultimately headed? What do you think? Someone said turning to Christ, okay. Where is the Bible, the story of the Bible ultimately headed? I heard someone say Jesus coming back. What do you think? Where is the Bible ultimately headed? A new heaven and a new earth. Interesting. Where is the Bible ultimately headed? Sorry, what? Cleansing us. Okay, where's the Bible ultimately headed? I'll stop asking this in a second. I just want to pull out more. Yeah. The rule of God. Okay, let's camp out on these thoughts. Somebody said the new heaven, and I think there's an element of all these answers that are right. The Bible is headed in all these places. I think you could say the story leads to all these places, to cleansing, to Jesus' return, because when he says, I'm leaving the temple and you won't see me again until you're ready to receive me, that's alluding to the fact that he's going to return at some point. And so all these things are mixed in, but we heard a new heaven and new earth. We heard God's rule. And if we start on page 1, Genesis, the creation, the ordering of everything, how things are ordered here on earth, and the relationship between God and these humans that he created. It was that God was ruling, but God created people to rule in the sense of cultivating the potential of the earth and causing it to flourish alongside of him. And so it's more than just God ruling. It's God ruling and inviting us into that cultivating of the world and everything, the creatures that he made, the plants that he made, the life that's possible here on earth. And it's us joining in that. But as Jinx mentioned a moment ago too, there's this idea of a new heaven and a new earth because creation was good, very good in the beginning. And then people chose to define good and bad in their own terms, by their own definitions. And that's what caused all these cycles to start in the first place. But there's a day that's anticipated where those cycles don't continue. And where people allow God's definition of what's good and bad to rule again, and where the earth is renewed and it's restored to the way it used to be, maybe even better than the way it's supposed to be. And it's a new heaven and a new earth. And so it's like heaven and earth come together, right? That's the future that the Bible anticipates. And I think that's probably how we should fill that blank in when we look at the completion. The completion isn't yet. There's still going to be more bucket tipping, and there's going to be battles and wars, and something about that is necessary to lead toward this ultimate completion. It's going to work out the chain of events that bring this ultimate completion about. But just to pause, we should expect a completion. These cycles will one day end. And that should be a glimmer of hope. Now Jesus is going to jump back into the cycles and tell us about more of these cycles. So we're going to go back and forth between the cycles that Jesus' followers are going to be caught up in, and also this idea of there's something better. There's an end point. There's a place where the story of the Bible is ultimately headed, and that place is good and beautiful, even better perhaps than where it started in the first place. Definitely as good as where it started in the first place. But they're going to continue. Verse 7, it says, for nation will rise up against nation. And the idea of nation, we see it as like very distinct countries with boundaries today. It's more the idea of cultures, different cultures that have leaders in the Bible. And kingdom against kingdom, and that idea of different governments are going to rise up against each other. Cultures and governments will clash. Has that been a pattern throughout human history? Have governments clashed? Have cultures clashed? I mean, think about even the history of the United States of America and how clashing of cultures has resulted, oftentimes to very unfortunate ends. He says next, there's going to be famines and earthquakes. And the word earthquakes in the Greek concept, as it was defined in the New Testament, that word's a little more broad. It can mean earthquakes and it can mean storms at the same time. Things that violently shake stuff. So like thunder is a violent shaking of the skies, and everything shakes when the lightning strikes, And when the earthquakes happen, everything shakes. So these natural catastrophes will occur. Food shortages, storms, and earthquakes. Has that been a pattern throughout human history? Definitely. Yeah, you read about places like Mount Vesuvius that took out, entire civilization villages, or Pompeii, or places, that were destroyed by volcanic activity thousands of years ago. And then you flip open your phone and you read about hurricanes and fires and earthquakes that have happened in the last 14 days, around the globe, even some within the last 48 hours. And you realize these cycles are still here. You just have access to more information, so you're always aware of things all the time. And then Jesus bounces back and he says, all these events are the beginning of labor pains. So he's talking about completion again now. And this idea, he's basically saying these cyclical pains, and these are pains, we all have to deal with them, and they're part of our world. These cyclical pains show that labor is commencing, it's beginning. So this completion, like it's going somewhere. And you kind of anticipate the birth of a child, even though in the moment my wife was not anticipating the pain that she was in the process of labor. But there's this glimmer of hope that someday the pains will end and there'll be something else, this child that we've anticipated, this beautiful life will come about, even though the process has been painful, toilsome, frustrating, discouraging all the time. These events are the beginning of labor pains. The cycles show that there's something good eventually coming. They stir in anticipation of what's to come and of hope. And then Jesus jumps back into the cycles again. He says, then they're going to hand you over to be persecuted, oppressed. Then they'll kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations because of my name. So he's saying to his followers, people from different nations are going to concentrate their hatred on you because you follow me. Can you see those cycles happening throughout history to people who claim the name of Jesus? In different cultures and different periods and different places, you can see those cycles happening even still today. And most of the hatred, the most intense forms of it, probably are concentrated on followers of Jesus in other countries around the globe. I mean, you may have to deal with some people who you don't appreciate your faith or who are critical of you, but are people going around killing you left and right here for your faith. Not at the moment. But this has been a pattern that people who have followed God have experienced throughout centuries, since the time of Jesus. He says, many false prophets will rise up and deceive or mislead many people. So there's going to be people who claim to speak for God, and they're going to cause people to wonder. You know of any people throughout human history who have claimed to represent God and pulled people away from him? Probably, right? You could write out dozens. And maybe we have to be careful, because if we're not careful, we could become one of those people as well. Because lawlessness, he says, will be multiplied. The love, and this is talking about the agape, the self-sacrificing love that the Bible mentions, of many people will be cooled. And so when you get in cycles, and these cycles are hard to deal with because it's injustice, right? All these things are forms of injustice, of the world going awry, or pain. They're all painful in different ways. It affects the way you feel and your emotions and your desire to sacrifice. And Jesus is saying, over time, these cycles get heavy, and people, their desire to love sacrificially cools off, because these things, they just start to impact even God's representatives because they're so heavy being stuck in these cycles. Think about maybe how certain seasonal cycles affect you. Do you ever get depression certain times of the year? You know, maybe. It's a real thing. And the same way, these human cycles start to have an effect on people's psyche as well. He says, this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed, and the idea is by the king's messengers. That's what the word proclaimed has behind it. By Jesus' representatives or by God's representatives, the king's messengers, in the whole inhabited earth as a testimony to all the nations. What's a testimony? Think about in court. Somebody takes the stand and they say, you know, this is what I saw, and this is what I believe to be true. So help me God, I'll tell the truth. This is what I saw. This is as best as I can tell, best as I can represent, this is what's accurate truth. So he says, news of God's kingdom, of what's accurate, of what people have seen and observed and experienced about God's kingdom, will be taken through all the inhabited earth. And God's kingdom, it's more than just the message about Jesus and his death on the cross for the sins of humanity, and Jesus is a bridge to God and a way of forgiveness. It's also about this life that Jesus mentions in Matthew chapters 5 and 6 and 7. It's upside down from this way of life. It's a love that loves even enemies. It's a love that loves neighbors as oneself, and so many more things. This whole ethic that Jesus has been teaching that we couldn't possibly summarize in a moment right now. That news, along with the salvation, the freedom from sin, the forgiveness of guilt, all those things packaged together in one, that's going to be carried throughout the inhabited earth. Then he bounces back to the completion. The completion should be expected. Verse 13, he says, but the one who endures to an end, to a completion, will be saved. And when I've read this before, I think our English Bible translations might miss out on a key word, because my translation says, the one who endures to the end will be saved, will be rescued. And I've always read this and I've thought in terms of that ultimate completion. Like if I happen to be alive at the point in time where all these cycles stop and this new heaven and new earth and this hope and this life that finally is characterized by the life that God wants his followers to live, and by the ethics of Jesus, if that life, suddenly happens during my lifetime, and I make it and I endure through all these pains and things that other parts of the Bible perhaps describe related to that point in time, if I could just make it through at that point in time, if I'm lucky enough to be alive then, then I'm going to be saved and rescued. Or maybe it makes me doubt my own salvation relationship with God because I think I have to endure. Like, what does this really mean? But what it really says is that the one who endures to an end, to a completion, will be rescued. And I think instead of talking about the completion, the end-all completion, Jesus might just be referring to each person's completion here. This is my theory, so don't take it to the bank. This is just what I see and what I think might be the case. Maybe Jesus is telling his followers, you may not see the completion of all things, but it's important that you keep persisting and enduring to your completion, to the end of your life. And when you do, you'll be rescued out of this cycle because you'll be taken out of this world that's characterized by this cycle. So maybe it's a statement to us that the goal isn't so much about waiting for the completion to arrive and hoping it happens in our lifetime as it is about just completing our course in the midst of all these cycles. Maybe that's what our focus should be on. And then Jesus says, and the completion will arrive. So at some point, there will be a completion, a final one, where all the cycles come to an end. But until then, maybe my focus should be on living out my completion in the midst of these cycles, with that hope in the back of my mind. The way that I want to kind of end things today, first of all, in a moment, I'm going to have our worship team come up because the first song that they led the service out with before we started with announcements, I felt like it related really well, as did actually about 3 or 4 of the songs on our worship set today with some of these concepts. And so I want our worship team to kind of make their way up and just lead us in that song one more time to close out the service today. But I think a good place for us to end this morning is just the thought of, what is my role in all of this as a follower of Jesus? I'm living in a world where I see these same cycles that Jesus was teaching his followers about, the realities of the way the world works, humanity works, the nature currently works. I see these same cycles continuing on today. So what's my role in all this? Why does God have me in a world that's characterized by these cycles? What's the point of it for me? What do you think? Why is Jesus telling his followers this? Why does he have you alive, subject to these cycles? What's your role in the midst of all this? What do you think?
To worship God.
To worship God? Okay. Okay, to be taught, you said, and then preach the word. Okay, those are good thoughts. Yeah. To know God and make God known. To love other people. Any more thoughts? Yeah.
To be able to stand for God in the last days when it's going to be the hardest.
Okay, to be able to stand for God. And you said in the last days when it's going to be the hardest. I would say there's a lot of hard things right now, and even maybe to stand for God right now as well. Perhaps, in harder days also to come. Yeah. Here's a few thoughts. I don't think that our role now is to feel helplessly trapped. To look around these cycles and say, I can't do anything about it. I'm discouraged. I just feel trapped in it all. I don't think that's why God has us here. I don't think it's to just be consumed with researching past and present events to try to decipher some code of whether or not I'm living in the time of this final completion. I don't think that's the primary focus of why Jesus is sharing this with his followers. Perhaps some of us would say, well, it's so I can prepare because I might have to survive the worst parts of these cycles. I mean, what if war comes to my back door? Or, what if natural disaster strikes here? Those are valid concerns. But is that why Jesus is telling his followers about that? Just so they can prepare to survive the worst case scenarios? Is it to wait outside and watch the sky, hoping that Jesus will come back and that Jerusalem is ready to receive him and he's going to waltz back into the temple and that's how we spend our days? I don't know. Maybe part of it is to be aware that we are just as vulnerable as any other human is to start perpetuating this same cycle. Maybe Jesus tells his followers, because one of the very first things he says, right, is watch out so you're not deceived. Maybe it's easy for us to follow into similar cycles. And so part of it is just being aware. These are human tendencies. Am I falling into one of those? I think part of it is what you guys said about learning and teaching and representing Jesus in the world. I think part of it, too, is to learn about injustice and the forms that it takes, but then to invite people into a different way. It's this recognition that nobody at any point on any one of these cycles, pick the worst cycle we talked about this morning, pick the person who's the most far gone, pick maybe a dictator somewhere who's just inciting a senseless war against people. It's recognizing that nobody's gone too far and that we're the people who God has in the world right now, in the midst of these cycles, to give an invitation and to dare to interrupt these cycles, to invade the cycles, and invite people who are caught up in the cycles to see that there is a way of hope, and there's a way of restoration, and there's something different. We are the representatives of Jesus in the world at this point in time, and he has opportunities right around the corner from you to represent him to the people that he's placed nearest to you in your life. And I think that's why we're here. And we still see the same cycles, but we're here to give the same invitation that his followers were there to give 2,000 years ago. And I think that's why you're here, and that's why you're caught up in the midst of these cycles, is to represent him, and also to have a glimmer of hope that these cycles won't exist forever.